So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I really love this book, like more than I thought I would. I don't know if I knew quite what to expect, but I think it's great, and I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to talk with you about it.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Um, can I ask you, when did you start working on this book, first of all?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Okay.
Yeah, maybe even sooner than that. I had in my mind what I wanted to write about. What I wanted to write about was my experiences teaching martial arts the last 30 years, how that relates to violence, keeping people safe, self-defense, training methods, pretty much the whole package. And I was always struggling to organize the material because I find organization of nonfiction books could be really difficult because there's no plot. And where's it going to go? Because I wasn't writing like a martial arts picture book that would go in the jiu-jitsu section next to some of my peers. And I just happened to have lunch one day with Sam Harris. I think it was 2014 or 2015. So it's a long time ago. Or I'm sorry, 24, 25. And he said to me, I think you're writing about violence. No, it was 2014 and 2015. But anyway, we talked about the book and he said, which I described to him what I was doing. And he said, you're writing about violence, just a general book on violence. And then when he said that, I realized, yeah, that is actually what I'm doing. And then that made it even a longer process because I wanted to make sure I had a couple of things I wanted to do. I wanted to dive into all the data and get a look at all the data, especially here in the United States, kind of free of any interpretations. And then after I looked at the raw data, I went back and read a tremendous amount of what was on the market just to make sure I wasn't going to be somebody else hadn't written the book I want to write. And then I started writing. So it's definitely, for me, a slow process. So that was 215 and yeah, it's been a while.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better because I'm still plugging away at the manuscript I've been working on for far too long now, too. I guess I want to show everyone the book first. It's called The Gift of Violence. And I think, so The Gift of Violence, Practical Knowledge for Surviving and Thriving in a Dangerous World. I think that what the book turned out to be and what you've written about and what I've learned was not what I expected to, which I think is a good thing. Because first of all, you write a lot, of course, about mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu. And you also write a lot about, the realities of violence. And as somebody, I came out of feminism and out of the left. I don't really identify with either of those categories or ideologies anymore. But, I remember when I used to try to describe feminism to people, it's always popular to try to argue about definitions of various ideologies and political factions amongst your mini factions. I would say, something like, I don't know, eradicating the patriarchy and ending violence against women. And I think that, that's, it sort of sounds cynical to say, but I think that's a naive goal for a number of reasons. One of which being that, like, the reality is that we can't eradicate violence, which is something that you talk about in your book. The idea that we can live in some kind of non-violent world is just never going to happen.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I was raised. I talk a bit about it in the beginning of my book, but I was raised. My mother was a pacifist, so she was Jehovah's Witness, and they have, they don't join the military. They won't be police officers. They won't do anything that involves carrying a gun. They definitely wouldn't do martial arts. So they have a very strict interpretation of Jesus's version of turning the other cheek. And on the other hand, I had my dad, who was a police officer, who was not a Jehovah's Witness, which is probably what saved me in the long run, having both points of view open to me. but I began to see the contradictions really early on. And when I would confront my dad about it, and I would say, try and make sense of it, his answer was always the same. He's like, well, if everybody believed like your mom did, we wouldn't need to have police officers. We wouldn't have those kind of problems. And that's true, but it's also irrelevant, because it's like saying, if there was no disease, we wouldn't need doctors. That's 100% true. If there was no disease, we need doctors. But there always will be, and there always has been, and they're with us. The instincts to commit violence, the reasons why people commit violence, the impulses to commit violence, they go very deep in our very nature, throughout the animal kingdom, throughout the whole world. I mean, that's Darwin talked about that quite a bit, and it's not going to go away. So understanding how to manage it and have a healthy relationship to it, I think, is the key. And the other thing I realized pretty early on too is anything that's that deep within our, for lack of a better term, call it primal self, anything that goes that far into who we are and how we evolved, like sexuality and other things, tends to get polarized, and people will repress and demonize it on one hand, or then they'll romanticize it or turn it into some kind of fetish on the other hand, neither of which is healthy. Mm-hmm. And you see people do this with violence all the time as well. So having a healthy relationship to the topic of violence is one of the goals of my book.
And I mean, you talk about that fetishization of violence in your book. And I think it's interesting to think about violence in a positive way, but not in a way that glorifies or fetishizes it. And I wonder how you think that we can accomplish that. I know that's like a huge question, but I mean, how can we treat or look at violence in a, let's say, a healthier way, without, I mean, the truth is that violence isn't all good or bad, right?
Right. It's a tool. It's a tool, and it can be used for very good purposes. And sometimes, as I mentioned in the book, violence is actually a very high moral imperative to engage in violence. If you see someone else being hurt or victimized, and you have an opportunity to step in, or your own loved one, or even yourself, I think people have a moral obligation to defend themselves against violent predators. So it can become one of our highest moral duties. The fetishization of it, the romanticization of it, I think women do that sometimes, but I think it's primarily a male problem. And I think it's related to maturity, and it's related to young men and having role models. I talk a lot about this in the book as well. The book's not a public policy book. It's about personal self-defense, but I think anybody reading between the lines can see some of the things I'm talking about there and some of the solutions that might be available. But young men really need strong fathers and or strong male role models in their life. And it's through those interactions, not just what their fathers say to them, but watching how their fathers interact with other men, how they engage with people, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, how to treat women, how to treat other people. All those lessons that they learn are invaluable. And what happens is, if you don't have that within the community, you have a lot of young men raising themselves and being raised by general culture. And that's when those problems really start to arise. I mean, you have Hollywood and you have everything else that plays on it. But the story I use in my book, which is a true story, when I was in Africa many years ago on a safari, they had elephants and rhinos that were coming up dead. And there's not many things that can kill a big full-grown rhino. But they'd found these rhinos that had been tortured and mutilated and all gored up. And at first they didn't know what it was, and they thought it could potentially be poachers, but the poachers would have taken the horns, and the rhinos weren't taking the horns. Their horns weren't taken. And they eventually figured out right away that it was young male elephants had gathered together into gangs and gone around and hunted down some of these creatures, and they were killing the rhinos. And the reason why that happened was because they were moving some elephants from Kruger National Park to Pilanesberg, And the straps that they had on the helicopter weren't heavy enough to carry the big male bulls. So they had brought female elephants, and then they brought some young male elephants, but they couldn't bring the bulls into the population. And immediately they ran into a problem where those young males banded together and started murdering rhinos. And as soon as they realized what was going on, they developed some straps and they managed to figure out how to get the bull male elephants there. Within a couple months, the problem stopped immediately. And I don't think that that's unique to the elephant population. I don't think it's unique to other primates. I think it's an important part of who we are as people. And so part of that, and part of not of understanding how to have a healthy relationship to that topic, is something that I think young men learn from their dads.
Yeah, and you write about your experiences with being bullied as a kid, and I've always thought, like the idea of boys getting bullied makes me feel really sad, but it's really, really common. It happens all the time, and it's really foundational, probably to most men's experiences growing up. And I think that it has a big impact and shapes who you are as a person. I wonder if you think that's sort of something that's inherent to men's lives or to masculinity, let's say.
I don't think it's inherent to bully other kids, but I do think that that comes as a result, again, of that lack of influence. So, that usually happens in school when the boys are in groups together and they're socializing together and there's not another male around, an older male anywhere around. And that's generally when these sorts of situations start to arise. And if you go back into the home life of a lot of the kids that engage in that kind of bullying, you're going to find a similar type of situation at home where they either have an abusive father and they've learned it from that, or they don't have a male role model in their life that is a strong and positive influence. And then the bullying, I think, just kind of naturally arises. And my response to it was to become very, very violent. And it worked. It was a more socially accepted response amongst my peer group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was the answer. It was just the others just basically flipping the coin over from fear to just aggression, which is relatively easy to do. And that happens to a lot of kids as well, where you'll see them snap and all of a sudden they'll do something incredibly violent. And people are wondering what's going on about that. So I think it goes back to just how important it is to be careful about how we socialize young men in school, before school, after school, having plenty of male role models around. And I don't mean to make it sound like it's exclusively men that can do this, but I do think it is important that there are men that can do this, because that's who young men will look to as who they can potentially become in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, when I've had these conversations before, and when I was researching the book, I want to, anytime I come up with something like this, I always want to know what the counter arguments are, the legitimate counter arguments to what I'm saying. And I won't usually write about anything or talk about anything unless I know the other side's point of view pretty well. And unfortunately, a kind of a knee-jerk reaction that happens a lot is people think in some ways I'm denigrating single mothers. I had a single mother, she was great, and my mom raised me, she was great. And absolutely. But if you think about it, what I'm saying is actually the opposite of that. The job of raising a healthy young man so he turns out to be a gentleman and understands how to navigate the world appropriately and not engage in that kind of violence is very hard. And by mentioning the fact that young men need those male role models and need fathers in their lives, I'm not actually denigrating single moms. I'm actually applauding them and talking about, the single moms who do a great job, they're doing a fantastic job, because it's actually a super hard job to do. In a way, I think it's a compliment.
Yeah. And when you were a kid and you got beat up, both your principal and your mom told you, and this surprised me a little bit, it does make sense when you explain it, of course, but
Yeah,
I was surprised at that response, particularly from a principal, because I wouldn't have expected it. They both told you to fight back, and your mom told you you got to go beat those boys up. Did
right.
you think that was good advice? I mean, what would you tell a kid who was getting bullied to do?
It was good advice because that's the only advice in that particular situation when things have gone that far that was going to help. Had I not done that, had I not stood up for myself and fought back at some point, that would have been a never ending, would have been torture throughout the rest of my school year. And I think deep down I knew that. What shocked me about that, particularly with my mom, that with the teachers, and I'm sure, this was in the early 80s, and I'm sure that things have gotten a lot better. I have 5 kids now and they go to school, and I can see how, things have certainly progressed. It was a little different back then. But with the teachers, I saw a lot of apathy and not a lot of concern for this kind of problem. And a lot of the times when this stuff happens, there's not a teacher anywhere to be found, and which also makes you wonder, what is going on. But with my mom, I was a bit shocked because I'd gone to church. When you're a Jehovah's Witness, you go to church 4 days a week minimum. So we'd have a Bible study on Tuesday, a 2-hour church meeting on Thursday night. You go door to door Sunday and knock on people's doors to try and make them be Jehovah's Witnesses. And then you do all day church service Sunday and sometimes go door to door Sunday. So 4 out of the 7 days a week, I'm being indoctrinated in this religion since I was born until I basically decided I wasn't going to go, which happened, I think, when I was about 13 and 14. I just said, I'm not going to do that. And my dad said that was okay. But um, so I was hearing this turn the other cheek message over and over again. And as soon as I came home, having been beaten, she immediately just, you know, turned the corner on that and got real angry and was talking to me how I need to beat the other kids up. And it was kind of shocking to me how quickly that principle just disappeared. So it took me a while to come to grips with that, but I did, and I went back and I talk about that a little bit in the rest of the book too, but not necessarily in the most appropriate way, but I did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what another response would be if you're getting bullied and beat up by boys at school. I mean, what else do? You can't turn the other cheek because you're getting punched.
Right, right.
And I mean, at what point was it that you started to get into fighting and martial arts, and why was it that you became interested?
I ever since I found out about the existence of martial arts, I was fascinated by them, and I used to spend most of my time reading when I was a kid, and most of my time in the public library, and so I would look in find the martial arts books in the sports section, and they had if you go in the magazine section of the little town we grew up in, they had like Black Belt magazine and stuff. So I was constantly reading through that kind of stuff, and I was interested always in what works and what doesn't work. And then when I was about 12 or 13, an old Bruce Lee movie, one of the ones that was made in China, not Enter the Dragon, because that came out in 1973, but another one was aired on TV. And it was the first time I saw a Bruce Lee movie. And I was like, man, this is amazing. And then I immediately began pestering my dad about what works and what doesn't work in a fight. Is this realistic? Is this not wanting him to watch movie scenes with me and kind of break it down, like what works? And I don't know if it was because the way I grew up. I tend to think it wasn't necessarily just the bullying because my interest in it predated that. I mean, I've always just had a natural fascination with what will work in a fight and what won't work in a fight. And in martial arts, they have what they call styles, and which styles are effective and which styles aren't effective. And the first UFC, actually, the which has now become the sport of mixed martial arts. But in the beginning, when it started, it wasn't about two fighters who know how to fighting in the cage. It was about matching up different styles. You'd have a Wing Chun guy versus a karate guy or something like that. And that was what I was obsessed with all my life.
And you spend a decent amount of time talking about various mixed martial arts styles, or, well, sorry, not mixed martial arts, but martial arts styles, a lot of which are, I mean, I don't want to be rude, and you know more about this than I do, but some of which I guess sounded to me like they were just money grabs. Like, there's these certain styles that I feel like I'd like people to know so that they make good choices when they're looking at learning how to fight or looking at going into martial arts, to choose something that's actually effective. I mean, at the end of the day, I think most people go into martial arts training, want to learn how to fight because they want to be able to defend themselves. Is that true?
100%. So most
Yeah.
people sign up because they want to be able to defend themselves. And most martial arts, most Asian martial arts in particular, are bullshit. They don't work. That's just a fact. And when I got out of the military, I started teaching. I went and joined a boxing gym, and I was looking at potentially becoming a professional boxer and was going that route. And I started training in martial arts called Jeet Kune Do Concepts, which was kind of a Bruce Lee's concept of training different styles together. And I became an instructor in that, and I was teaching what we call Muay Thai kickboxing, which is Thai kickboxing and boxing. And I became pretty disillusioned with that community as well, because some of what they would show is very realistic. Boxing is very realistic. I mean, it's the most realistic thing way it gets as far as striking. And then other material they would show was absolutely ridiculous. It was, if I was trying to teach somebody how not to fight, I don't think I could organize anything even dumber than what they were doing. And they weren't discriminating between the two, which bothered me. And people would come to me and ask me questions, why does this style work? And that style doesn't work. And what I eventually realized after a few years of watching this and going through it was the one thing every martial art that works has in common is it's a combat sport. And so those are the arts that you see trained in MMA these days. But, judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, which is a very functional martial art, Greco-Roman or freestyle or folk style wrestling, Muay Thai, all these arts, the thing that they have in common is they're sports. And the thing about sports is you care about the result. So you use a practical epistemology, you use some form of an opponent process. You use what I call a live training. And so the distinction between the martial arts that work and the martial arts that don't work is the training method. And it's just like philosophy. It's about the method you use to arrive at the conclusion as opposed to the conclusion itself. And they have some form of training method where you're dealing with timing, energy, and motion, and you're working against an adaptive, progressively resisting opponent, and you're not pretending, to do it. So if I'm in judo club and I'm working and I get a throw and I take somebody down, I actually got that throw. They're trying not to let me take them down. I'm trying to throw them. If we're wrestling, somebody takes me down and I sprawl and I miss and they get me on my back, they did it. They got me on my back. If I'm rolling in jiu-jitsu and I take somebody's back and I apply a choke and they tap out, I got the choke. They weren't pretending to give me the choke. But in other martial arts like Aikido and Kung Fu and different things like that, it's basically just choreography. And the two people are playing together in a kind of choreographed form. And there is no aliveness. And so the word that I came up with, it's just a single word that would explain what works always in a fight and what doesn't work, and what the most important thing about martial arts is aliveness, timing, energy, and motion. And if people understand that one concept, then I feel like they're pretty much bullshit proof when it comes to martial arts. They can go out, they can watch any martial arts demonstration or see anything, and you'll be able to recognize what will be functional and what will be fantasy, and which training methods work and which training methods don't work. So even though my book is not a technique book, it's not about martial arts techniques, I definitely made sure I included a chapter on that, so that if people do take my advice and they engage in some kind of combat sport, which I think is important, if you want to learn to defend yourself, having some kind of combat sport background will be the way to go. they can use that chapter to help them filter through and find a place that I think will be a good training spot for them.
Yeah. And it's interesting because so I've only been into MMA and like watching UFC for, probably like the last couple of years. I've always liked boxing, but I was never super into it. I go to a Muay Thai Jiu-Jitsu gym here, although I just do boxing and weight training. So I know now like a lot of men who are into Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai. My partner does Muay Thai. And I think and I love MMA. I love watching it. I find it super interesting and obviously entertaining, but it involves so much more training and skill than I would have imagined before I started really paying attention.
That's
And I
right.
think that's pretty common. I mean, as you know, like this was a sport that was illegal
Yep.
at one point, and people just considered it to be brutish. I think which politician said that it was like human cockfighting?
John McCain.
Right.
John McCain. Yeah, I missed the boat on that because when I started training and started my school before the UFC, before the first UFC, and one question people often ask me is like, "Hey, did you realize how big the sport was going to become? You know, it's the fastest growing sport amongst the 20 something demographic in the world." I had no idea. I honestly thought that they were going to completely ban it because at the time there was only a couple places where you could go to put on a fight, and we would have to put our fights on at Indian casinos to get around the law.
Okay.
So yeah, I did not see the popularity of the sport coming. I really did think it was going to be something that was going to be banned, but not anymore. I think that sport's here to stay, and it's huge. It's growing huge now.
Yeah, and I think one of the other big misconceptions is that these guys themselves are all brutish. I think that people who don't watch MMA, who don't know anything about the sport, um, I think I think they do just think of it as brute violence, especially when if you're just seeing clips and there's blood everywhere, or somebody's knocked out. But I mean, you wrote about this, and I've learned this recently too, is that actually like guys who really do know how to fight and who are trained in these forms of martial arts, actually, I think are some of the safest, least brutish, least dangerous men. I mean, so long as you're not trying to pick a fight with them.
Yeah, no, that's very often true. I think that functional martial arts and that kind of training is a necessary but not sufficient component for certain parts of self actualization and making yourself a better person. In other words, making good people more dangerous to bad people, which is one of the goals of my organization and one of the goals of the book, also makes better people. And part of that is just because of what you have to put yourself through. So if you're gonna reach a level of black belt skill in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which anybody can do if they train long enough and hard enough, by definition, you are going to have to submit, tap, say I quit thousands of times. You're going to be held down. You're going to get smashed. Somebody's going to put your arm. You got to tap. You got to over and over and over. And you will also submit other people over and over too. But especially the first part of that and on your way through, you're probably going to do a lot more tapping than having people tap to you. And very difficult to imagine many things that can instill more humility than that. And one of the things I like about it too is it teaches people not just what they can do, but it's also very important. It teaches them what they can't do. I mean, anybody that's been training for a couple of years has a real good handle on what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And they're not going to have any kind of, immature fantasies in their head about the nature of violence and how things can go. While at the same time, they will have accumulated a skill level that very few people have. And the other side of that coin is sometimes we forget because once you started training for a few years and doing this, you're always training against other people who know what we do. So when I'm rolling in the gym, I'm rolling against other people who are capable of beating me and know what I do and have been training as long as I have. And when you're dealing with somebody who has no idea about any of this, um, it's just a whole different level, and so that's where the combat sports really become invaluable as far as helping people learn how to defend themselves, but also just making better people. Having to tap out over and over again and admit that you've lost over and over again, and then control your emotions and be okay with that. Get back on the mat and grab that person again so you can try and problem solve and work through that problem, which is what you need to do with jujitsu. It's like a puzzle. You can't avoid the person that just beat you. You got to go get them again and again until you figure out how to solve that, whatever they got you with. And then they do the same thing. And it's basically kind of an arms race. And the two of you evolve together. That's how jujitsu works. And that's a very humbling process. It's a deeply humbling process. And so I've met people who were jerks in jujitsu and in professional fighters and stuff. There's no doubt about that. But the vast majority of the people that I meet when I travel around and do seminars, the students, and they're really nice people. So my buddy Peter Bogosian, who I think you know is one of my purple belts, and now when he travels around, he likes to go train at jujitsu schools, just wherever he's on tour. He's in Australia right now, training with some of my friends in Australia. But he always remarks to me over and over again, it's like, these are the nicest people, every time I go in, and everybody's so gentle and, kind. And yeah, that's been my experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, they really are. Like I mentioned earlier that I go to a Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu gym, and the guys there, it's like the best gym I've ever gone to. I've never even really liked going to a gym, and it's so warm. It feels so non-judgmental.
Yeah.
There's women and men who are training together. It feels like a community. I feel like everyone there is super respectful. And I think that must be inherent to that community in the sport, in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I wonder if you can talk a little bit about. I mean, it sounds like you were one of the first people in the U.S. to get involved in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Can you talk a little bit about where Jiu-Jitsu came from, and how this particular form of martial art came to be?
Yeah. So jujitsu is Japanese in origin. It was a Japanese battlefield art. So when you lost your weapon and you had to engage in hand-to-hand combat, that's what it was for. Incorporated throws and clinch and ground fighting and even some strikes. And at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, you had some Japanese immigrants that wanted to move to Brazil, and they got help by a gentleman. I think his name was Rickson Gracie, the original, and he was just a member of the Brazilian government, and he was able to help them get visas and help them immigrate into Brazil. And in gratitude for that, they taught his son, Carlos Gracie, jiu-jitsu. So Carlos Gracie learns the art of Japanese jiu-jitsu. And back then, jiu-jitsu and judo weren't quite separated the way they are now into different sports. It was all kind of the same battlefield art. And he learned it, and then he started taking on these challenge matches, him and his brothers. And Brazil was kind of the perfect place for this to happen because it's an honor culture, patriarchal society where they're going to get in fights. And if these two guys fight, other people aren't going to run in and kick them in the head and try and break it up. It's like, okay, those two guys are going to fight. We're going to now stand and watch and let them fight until the fight's over. So the petri dish, if you will, of what they were doing is one-on-one combat, pretty much no rules, and we're going to go until someone submits or is unconscious. And they just did that over and over and over again. And through that evolution, they developed jiu-jitsu, Japanese jiu-jitsu, and they modified it to work in what they call vale tudo, which is anything goes kind of environment with strikes. And The history of the Gracie family is quite weird. It's kind of like a, uh, how can I say this without getting in trouble? It's a bit like a polygamist Mormon slash mafia kind of family. It's just a weird. It was a weird, super patriarchal family where the men would have many wives, many kids, looking for boy kids, building an army, and then pitting their kids up against each other to determine who the family champion would be. And that was kind of what the Gracies did. They had their own weird, superstitious diet and all kinds of other stuff that they had kind of invented. And so then they started doing challenge matches in Brazil where they would fight anybody, no time limit, coming in the cage and fight, including Carlos's younger brother, Elio, who was kind of thin and frail. And you had a guy named Count Kavanagh, a Japanese champion who came over and had a fight with Elio. He won that fight, but he was actually quite famous too. He would travel around the world, and he also worked with Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of people don't know, but Teddy Roosevelt was big into Japanese jiu-jitsu and put a ring in the White House so he could train, and he had trained with this guy. So that's how the art evolved. It was Japanese in origin, heavily modified by the Brazilians. And then around the time of the 60s, Elio's children, which included Rickson, who was one of my instructors, and Holes Gracie and others, started to compete and started to move around. And they started to come in contact with Americans. They started to come in contact with American wrestling. And they started to blend that in because a lot of what we do in American wrestling was better than what they were doing. And that started. So now it became American influenced. And the art developed from there in these challenge matches over and over and over again, most of which they won. And then Elio's oldest son, Horian, moved to the United States. And his way of promoting the art was to put out a challenge match of anybody that could beat him in one-on-one combat. He would give him $100,000. That was called the Gracie Challenge. And he had a very famous article in Playboy magazine where he challenged anybody to fight him. And that eventually morphed into the UFC. And the UFC was his younger brother, Royce. Royce was kind of skinny, unassuming kid. I think most people that would have looked at him and then looked at some of the other fighters would have assumed he would lose. I knew he was going to win just because I had been training the art, but most everybody would look and see he was going to lose. He wasn't like Rickson. Rickson, his older brother, who's my coach, looks like a carnivore. He looks like somebody that's not going to lose. But Royce did not. And famously, Royce won those fights, and that was it. Then the art, what originally started in Brazil, now started to blossom in LA. Also, Horian choreographed the first Lethal Weapon. So if you watch Lethal Weapon with Mel Gibson, some of the fight scene at the end where he does a triangle choke on the guy and stuff, that was all Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. But that's how it started, and then it just took off from there.
And one of the things that you write about people who are interested in learning self-defense is how many misconceptions people have about what would be a danger to them, who's dangerous, who the predators are going to be, why they're learning self-defense in the first place. And one of those things is the stranger violence aspect. I think a lot of people, and I totally relate to this. I mean, I think that there's something natural about fearing someone's going to, break into your house and attack you. A stranger is going to attack you in a dark alley, especially if you're a woman. But why should people be actually learning self-defense, learning how to defend themselves? What is sort of a more common predator, let's say?
Yeah. So when I was looking at the data, so you have all kinds of myths about martial arts, and then you have a lot of myths as well about self-defense and violent attackers. And most of what's written in the clinics that I would go to, And the good material, I don't want to put the material down. It was all valuable and useful, but it was always geared towards the stranger in the street who's going to attack you. You know, you're walking back to your parking lot, and here comes somebody and trying to rape you or to assault you in that way. And the data just doesn't reflect that. The vast majority of assaults, the vast majority of murders, the vast majority of rapes, almost all violent crime is committed by somebody you know. And a lot of people tend to forget that. And I didn't really see much, if anything, on the market that talked about that. And there's multiple reasons for it. I think part of it is because most people just naturally assume strangers who they need to be more worried about, because I think they think intuitively, and this can be dangerous as well, that they are already patrolling the boundaries of their life, and maybe they're not really in a way that they should be. Or they don't feel like they're that demographic. Like there's a demographic of people who hang out with people that are going to get attacked because the type of person they hang out with. But in my case, it would definitely be a stranger. And so I wanted to make sure that I addressed that in the book, and I talked about that actually first. And I talk about threats in order of priority. And the first threat that you have to worry about are the ones that you already have close to you, the ones that you let in your house, the ones that you let around you, how to identify them, who they are before it gets to the point where it turns violent. If we talk about women in general, in particular, half of all women in this country are murdered by a husband or significant other. Half. So if you take that out, that's like 50% of the murders of women in this country disappear if we just take that one piece out. That's how big it is. And in almost every one of those cases, it's preceded by long, multiple incidents related to stalking, almost every time. And so I want people to know about that. When we talk about kids and we talk about sexual exploitation of kids or abuse, yeah, there's a possibility. I mean, as a parent myself, I can't imagine a worse nightmare than, your kid disappears and you don't know where they are. That's horrendous. But the reality is, it's almost always somebody you know. And if we're talking about boys or girls getting molested, it's almost always somebody you know, a friend of the family, somebody that you know and talk to. So how to be aware when those kind of people are around. I use the term character disordered very intentionally in my book, because the point I want to get across is that when people repeat errors like that over and over again, it's not a mistake, it's a character flaw. And you need to create boundaries between yourself and those kind of people, and keep those people away and safely from your life. And so if someone is judicious about that and they're paying attention to that, about that, this big, huge chunk of, like, we'll call it the statistical odds of you being involved in some horrible event, gets cut way down, massively down, by keeping those people out of your life and paying attention to when the character disordered people are in your vicinity. And even when we talk about strangers, even in those circumstances, it's not the type of situation where they're just all of a sudden on you and they're trying to grab you and they're trying to put you in a car. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. That can happen. But the vast majority of those cases, they too approach you or whoever, and there's a short relationship that's going to ensue, where they're going to engage in dialogue, and they're going to be checking out to see if you seem like a good potential victim, and they're going to be asking you questions, and they're going to begin as a character disordered person, and then they're going to turn into a violent attacker, assuming that you look like somebody who would be a good target for them. But it's very rarely just no conversation, no interaction, no chance, no time to see or feel what's happening, which is also super important, because we have those evolutionary instincts within us, and you can feel it when it's starting to come on. And it just, boom, they're on you. That's extraordinarily rare. In reality, there's usually plenty of warning signs leading up to it. And I wanted people to be aware of those warning signs, and most of all, pay attention to them. I do talk about things to look for, things that other people may not necessarily always know, so that they can pre-incident indicators, so that they can be wise to situations where they might need to pay a little more attention. But the truth is, you almost don't need much of that, because everybody else has these great instincts, and you will feel it when you have a predator in your midst. And where it becomes dangerous is when people start rationalizing those thoughts away because they want to be nice, or they don't want to appear whatever racist, or they don't want to think that of people. The more you're rationalizing in your mind away what your gut is telling you in a given moment, the more concerned you should be about that particular situation.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that a lot of women do that. I think that a lot of women talk themselves out of their gut instincts. They might feel that a guy seems sketchy, or they might feel something and they might not recognize what that something is, and then talk themselves out of it because they don't want to be judgmental,
Right.
or they don't want to be mean. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what are women recognizing? What are they sensing? What is that gut instinct, for those who have talked themselves out of trusting it?
I think that the instincts for women and the instincts for men are very often different. And so one of the things I say in my book is that, if your wife or girlfriend or loved one or daughter or somebody is expressing some concern about having her instincts going off about this particular male, and you don't necessarily notice anything wrong, you should make sure you pay attention to her, because sometimes they're different. And the signals that those kind of people will send to women may be very different from the signals that they send to men.
Mhm.
And so the first thing is just to be able to pay attention to it. So I talk about with my daughters what I teach them, and I keep it really simple, just A, B, C. The first thing is awareness between you and them about communication, where they feel comfortable telling you anything and telling you about how they feel. And they're aware that they have those instincts, and they're aware that they should be paying attention to those instincts, and a certain amount of education about things, just sketchy things to be paying attention to, things when things just don't look right. And then boundaries, making sure they understand what their boundaries are and that they're really comfortable defending those boundaries, and knowing that not only is it okay to defend those boundaries, that's what you want them to do. And then when they do defend those boundaries, you will always back them up. You're going to be on their side. And then the last piece of that is just making people comfortable with conflict, because I think a lot of times both women and men, but especially in cases with women, sometimes they're not comfortable with conflict and they're trying to avoid conflict. And then that actually creates more of a problem. And that's something you can practice. That's something you can work on like any other skill. So if they're aware of what's going on around them, and you're aware of how they're feeling, and they're aware that they need to pay attention to those instincts, and they have a clear understanding of their own personal boundaries, and an understanding that those boundaries are important, and that they have a right and they owe it to themselves to defend those boundaries. And then you make them comfortable enough with conflict through practice that they can engage and I not necessarily mean physical, but just verbal, being clear with no and what you're not willing to do, and being assertive. Most all of these problems can be dissipated, because predators are lazy. The predators in the natural kingdom and animal kingdom and human predators are lazy. They go to the easiest target. They're not going to go to the target that looks like it's going to put up a fight. They're going to move on to the next one in almost every case. In school shootings, if there's a school shooter and he's walking through the door, and he checks the handle and the door's locked, yeah, he could kick down the door. Yeah, maybe he could break the window and shoot the kids in that room. But the most likely thing he's going to do is go to the next door until he finds a door that's open. And then that's the place where he's going to, attack the children. So they're lazy, and understanding they're lazy, you understand that you set these boundaries up, you maintain these boundaries, and you're comfortable engaging in that conflict with them, they're more than likely going to move on to another target.
And what about the people who are already in your midst, the family members, the husbands, the boyfriends? What are the warning signs there? I mean, like you say, this is for kids, the biggest danger is going to be somebody they already know, somebody who's a family member or maybe like a close family friend or something like that. And for women, it's probably going to be their boyfriend or their husband.
Yeah. So I give a list for what I call character disordered people in the book. But with children, it's the same kind of thing. If a child like doesn't want to kiss someone or show affection to someone, you don't want to be in a position where you're like, well, you should give Uncle Joe a kiss or whatever. You don't want to do
Mhm.
that kind of thing. We need to listen to children. I tell a story in the book that happened. I was giving a talk here in Portland many years ago, and my wife was in the audience, and she was sitting next to my daughter, who at the time I think she must have been 7 or 8. And the guy that was sitting next to my daughter kind of put his arm around her, went to touch her in some way, and she kind of recoiled from him. And I was watching it from my vantage point. I was watching what was going on, and my wife was quite aware of what happened. And my wife just kind of gave him a look, and then she pulled my daughter in and kind of, in a way, kind of commended her for that, and then paid attention. And as I was watching the situation and I assessed it, I didn't think the guy meant anything terribly bad about it. I don't think he was necessarily a predator. Um, but what I was proud of was how my wife reacted and how my daughter reacted, because my daughter didn't want that guy touching her. She doesn't know him. So it's like, don't put your hand on me. And my wife commended her for that. And that was the perfect response. And I think that was a great lesson for my daughter at that time. And it could have been a terrible lesson had that gone the other way, where my wife had, not wanting to be rude, had maybe, um, you know, told Annika off for doing that. So teaching your kids about that is very important. And when you're dealing with character disordered people, it's the lists are very simple: insincere, fake personality.
Mhm.
Do they feel like they're trying to sell you something? Like, why do I always feel like you're trying to sell me on some sort of proposition? A tendency to um, have outbursts and insults and emotional reactions where they're constantly coming back. Failure to take personal responsibility is a huge one. If in every given situation is somebody is not taking personal responsibility, it's always someone else's fault, always some other story. That's a big one. And then eventually you get to the point of physical violence, where they go from expressive violence, which is, yelling and insulting and making excuses for their behavior, to where it turns physical. But if you can realize who these people are in advance and keep them out of your life. And I know it's hard to do with family sometimes. And that's a call every individual has to make on their own. But I do think it's important sometimes, if you have a family member like that, just to create really strong boundaries from your family and them. And just, if that person's going to be in your life or they're going to be around, you're going to have a conversation with them about how they're allowed to act and how they're not allowed to act. And if they're not going to engage in that, I think you have to sometimes separate yourself from those kind of people.
And what did you learn in your research about how these character disorders, as you call them, develop? Is this something people are born with? Is it something that's developed through, I don't know, family role modeling, trauma, stuff like that?
Yeah, everything I've read over the years, it it seems pretty clear to me that it's always a case of both. And it's very hard to put a number on that, nature, nurture. But generally speaking, I think the more studies that come out and the more we read about it, the more I see about it, the more we start to realize how much of it actually is nature and how many things really are inherited traits that we might not even think of as an inherited trait, really idiosyncratic, strange behavior that actually was something that wasn't necessarily learned. But at the same time, you also usually have an environment where the individual grew up where they were exposed to that as well. That's how they learned to socialize. Maybe their parents were that way. So it's almost always, I think, a combination of nature nurture. I think you have two different types. So you'll have the most common type, which is a reactive aggressive. And a reactive aggressive is somebody who's going to lash out. They're going to be quick tempered. They're not going to take personal responsibility. They're going to go for your weak points. They're going to berate you. And that's the most common type. And that's where there'll be a heated argument. All of a sudden it turns violent. And that's where the police will wind up having to show up to a domestic dispute, and there's two brothers fighting, or there's a husband battling with a wife or something like that. And that's the majority of who we see in prison, is reactive aggressives. And there, from a nature standpoint, I do think that it's pretty clear that there's something going on with the prefrontal cortex and a lack of empathy, impulse control, a failure to be able to push that pause button. And so that is definitely hardwired in many ways. And then on the other side of that, you have people who use violence in a very instrumental way, and they can be far more dangerous. And that's where we're talking about legitimate psychopaths, the sociopaths. But they're also, I think those people are also actually quite rare. There's not that many of them around. And the interesting thing, I didn't get too much into this in the book, but when you start to study about that, the interesting thing is the areas where reactive aggressive criminals might have deficiencies in that prefrontal cortex and inability to restrain themselves. The people who are true high-level sociopaths and psychopaths, that part of their brain actually lights up even more. Like very high functioning, like the Ted Bundy archetype of that, or so. But the odds of running into somebody like that are quite small.
And how does the prefrontal cortex factor in, and in terms of I think you describe it as abnormalities, and sometimes if it is damaged, I think that it can cause these kinds of character disorders in some way. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think part of it can be inherited. I think part of it, nature is born, but it also can be exacerbated by drinking during pregnancies, drugs during pregnancies, abuse. So all those factors come into play. I mean, if you have, let's say, worst case scenario, you have very aggressive, reactive aggressive parents, or father or mother who has poor impulse control. They have a child, they pass along a lot of those traits. They're abusive to that child. They drink heavily during the pregnancy. Maybe they've taken some drugs during the pregnancy as well. All of that, we know too, also damages that part of the brain, and can cause a lot of damage to that part of the brain. And now you have a child that's got the worst of both worlds. They've gotten the worst of nature and nurture, and you get kids out there who really do lack self-awareness, empathy, and impulse control. And the one thing I tried to get across in the book, my first big, I think, realization when I started to look at the data was problems related to the root cause, I believe, of most of what we call problematic violence. So in the book, I'm talking about interpersonal violence, not warfare and terrorism and things like that. And interpersonal violence every year, generally speaking, kills 4 times as many people as war. So, and that's crime and abuse and that kind of thing. And the major issue, as I believe, as it relates to interpersonal violence, the major problems are issues related to maturity. And I still think you have a lot of people in this out there, a lot of politicians, a lot of other people who believe they're economic, and that people are engaging in many of these activities because they're going hungry, or they need food, or even, trying to get money to buy drugs. And while all those things can play a role, the biggest, if you talk to the police officers and you look at the data, and the biggest category for homicide in this country are fatherless young men killing other fatherless young men between the ages of 16 and 22, 23. That's by far the largest age group, over issues related to status, petty issues related to status. And that general lack of maturity, which I define as self-awareness, empathy, and impulse control. And it's dangerous when you have a lot of these young men all together raising themselves, absent many strong male role models. They're going to form gangs, and this is what we see now. And the only short-term solution that we have for it, to put a stop to it in the beginning, is more police. And then when we find the repeat violent offenders, by the time one of them shoots another one, they've usually been arrested 11 to 12 times. They've already been convicted of multiple felonies. It's already illegal for them to carry a weapon, but they've been caught and released in kind of a revolving door, and then eventually they kill someone. But almost all of those crimes, if you go back and check, were crimes related to status, respect amongst their peer group. That is the biggest portion of the violence. When we see the huge spike that we've seen in this country in the last 2 years since the summer of 2019, that's what that spike is. That's young men killing other young men over status.
Yeah, and I mean, you wrote about, you called it boy speak, but you wrote about this kind of bravado and this, I think that people misread confidence and assertiveness. You talk about that as well as well, they misread bravado, and they misread like aggression as confidence and assertiveness. And it's not that. And I think men often kind of misread that about themselves. Like they think, oh, like I'm tough, I'm assertive, like I'm a real man's man, I'm a protector, because they act like assholes.
Right. They're mistaking fear or concern that they're causing in other people due to their behavior for respect, which is pretty common, because they don't know what real respect is. They hadn't been shown what real respect is. And how would they know if there's no strong male role models in that community that they can look up to, that can kind of show them that? What they have is each other, and then what they see or in the media, or what they hear in music or popular culture. And that sense of bravado, that idea that you're going to instill fear and concern in other people, that when they see you coming, people are going to want to cross the street because they're frightened of what you might do. To them, that gets misplaced, that gets miscategorized as respect. And that is a currency that they're looking to accumulate in their short-lived lives on the street. And then eventually it just winds up leading to prison. But yeah, it's
I mean, what does healthy confidence look like, or assertiveness in a man? What does an actually kind of confident, tough, assertive man look like?
Well, I think, things that young men learn from their fathers is how to look at people when you're talking to them, how to look them in the eye, how to shake their hand, how to stand up for the things that you believe in, how to stand up for other people when the time is right, when you feel you need to stand up for them, how to be polite, how to engage in a way where you're not showing weakness, you're being strong, but you're also kind. And really, real strength has far more in common with kindness than it does fear or cruelty. Cruelty is always associated one way or another, is basically usually just the flip side of the coin of weakness. So they, by being exposed to men like that, and they can see how this person carries themselves, how they engage, how they handle disputes, how they communicate with other men, how they treat women, how they talk to other people. I mean, all those things are so important. And they learn not just from being told, but more importantly, from watching and seeing people actually model that behavior real time. And that's what real competence looks like. We all know it when we see it. And it doesn't have to come from a man. I've used an example in my book before. I've had plenty of women who carry themselves with confidence and gay, effeminate men who are small. It's not so much about,
Mm-hmm.
being big and strong as it is being someone who is going to stand up for yourself and stand up for your values and carry yourself in such a way where that's clear. And, I don't remember if this story made it in my book, but I had a friend of mine who was a young woman who was very attractive, and she lived in the worst possible neighborhood here in town for a long time. A neighborhood where a lot of people wouldn't go and walk because it was just always such a hassle. But she would walk her dog there pretty much every night. She'd say hi and walk her dog. She never had a problem. And it was just the way she carried herself.
Yeah.
She had her eyes forward. She knew where she was going. Her shoulders were back. She's walking her dog, and people drove by and looked. And that if I mess with her, that's going to be a problem. She's going to give us a hard time. The study, I used a couple of examples of studies in my book, but they've done these studies over and over and over again, and they've repeated them where they'll go into prisons and they'll show prisoners brief clips of people. The one that I was talking about was done, I think, in New York, where they only showed them from the head down. So from the neck down, walking a crosswalk. And these guys were professional violent criminals, muggers, things like that, rapists. And they would have them walk by, and they would have them rate the people that were walking by on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you would really want to attack them, and 1 being you really wouldn't want to attack them. And they would only give them a couple seconds. So you see the person walk, and then they're just 1 to 10, 1 to 10. And they discovered that there was remarkable similarities between, they were all picking the same people, all within a point of 2. And it basically just came down to, in that particular study, how people carried themselves when they crossed the street, how they walked.
And was that sort of like they looked like people who lacked in confidence?
Yeah, the people who were inclined to be attacked were, kind of walking, their arms weren't moving or their arms were down, and they looked like they were, lack of a better term, confident, or maybe they had a limp or a gait where they looked like they might have been a wounded animal. But people were upright, just walking across the street like they knew where they were going, and like, yeah, I'll put that person down as a 2 or 3.
Right.
It's not somebody I'm going to attack.
I'm curious to know what you think about women's self-defense classes. I mean, a lot of these things are sort of, day-long or weekend-long workshops, and they, claim to teach women skills to protect themselves against potential predators. I wonder if you think those ever work.
There are definitely things you can learn from it, and I think things that you have to be careful of. So we do workshops like that as well. And one of the things when I do a workshop like that I always try and explain to everybody is, I'm not going to teach you how to fight in 2 days. I'm not here to show you how to fight. The best use of those kind of workshops is explaining to people a lot of the things that you and I have been talking about here, what to look for, what to be aware of out in the world that should cause alarm bells for you, how important it is to listen to your own instincts. And then we talk the physical training things that we do is we practice walking, or we practice having people be assertive, or we'll practice having a woman stand in a room and having someone else encroach upon her, and for her to be able to say no, or to be able to say stop. And if they fail to stop, and they fail to answer her to commands, for her to raise her voice and become more assertive. And that can be really hard for a lot of people. And I've seen a lot of people struggle just to be to be assertive in that way, to be able to raise their voice in that way. So from that standpoint, I think that those workshops can be really useful for people, to give people a better idea of just how to carry themselves, how to say no or fuck no or stop, or and general things of what to look for when you're out and about. In terms of physically fighting off a bigger, stronger attacker, you're not going to learn much in 2 days. It's going to be very helpful. But I would still encourage people to fight. If you have the choice between complying and fighting, I think in general, in almost, I'm never going to say never, but in most cases, I want to see people fight and do the best they can because, like I said, predators are lazy and tend to be weak, and they don't want somebody that's going to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many stories of women that had no training whatsoever, but are able to fight off, true predators.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough, I know that I'm focusing on the woman angle a lot. But it's like a conundrum, right? I mean, the situation is grim. There is a lot of violence against women. There's a ton of male violence against men also, of course. But for women, I sort of wonder if they ever really stand a chance. I mean, if women do martial arts training like boxing, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, stuff like that, I mean, do they stand a chance against a male predator?
Sure. Oh yeah. I have multiple female black belts that I have taught. So I have, I think at this stage, 35 black belts of my own, of which, don't quote me on this exactly, but I think 6 are women. 2 world champions, former world champions.
Wow.
One of them, named Lily, she started with me when she was 51, 52. She earned her black belt when she was 69.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and she's very small. I don't know what Lily weighs, but probably not 100 pounds. She's a very tiny woman. And I've watched her in seminars roll with guys. Rolling is like sparring,
Yeah.
And submit them. Where she would catch them in an arm lock and they're forced to tap, or she would have broken their arm, or she'll get on the back and perform a choke. So can it be done? 100%. Is it hard? Yeah, it's hard. And the bigger and stronger the other person is, the more you have to make up for that with technical skill. So the woman has to be the female athlete, just like if it was a smaller male athlete. Jiu-jitsu, it's really interesting because jiu-jitsu is one of the only martial arts where smaller people really can consistently beat bigger, stronger people, provided that they're better at jiu-jitsu. And that's been proven time and time again. So now if you're both equal skill, then obviously that's why there's weight classes in the sport. But if you have a small black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the belt is just like a symbol of a tangible skill level that you can't fake any more than you can fake speaking Spanish or playing a guitar. So you can fake being a fake martial artist, but you can't pretend to be good at jiu-jitsu any more than you can pretend to speak Spanish or French, because somebody is going to come in and go, hey, let's roll. And then right away, you're like, fuck, this guy doesn't know how to speak French, right?
Yeah.
So the belt means that. And if you have a black belt level person who's 135 pounds, and you get a guy off the street who's 220 and they're a white belt or a blue belt, I almost bet my mortgage that black belt will tap them out over and over and over again. It might be a battle. It might be a bit rough. It might take 10 minutes. It's not going to be easy, but 9 times out of 10, the black belt will wind up winning that match. And that's the only sport, the only martial art really where I think I've ever seen that can do that consistently. And part of it is because when you're on the ground, a lot of the power that you have from size and from weight gets nullified, especially if you're on your back. But even when you're on top, like how much could someone shot put if they're standing up and throw a big metal ball? And then if you put them on their knees You know, how far is that shot put going to go? And then if you have them lay on their back, right, how far is that going to go? So the ground is a great equalizer, assuming that you know how to use it as an ally. And so it really is possible. It's not easy. It's hard. Takes years to get good at jiu-jitsu. I mean, I don't think people even begin to approach the level of being good until about 10 or 11 years of training multiple times a week. Because it's complicated, because it incorporates literally every position you could find yourself on the ground with another human body. And so you have to learn all of them, all of that, and then drill it. But yeah, it can be done. And, you know, one of my black belts, Leah Taylor, goes around and gives women self-defense workshops. She's a former world champion, and she'll beat men all the time. Especially the lower belt men. But the other thing too, you know, combined with that, her ability to do that, she also has a crystal clear understanding in her mind of what she can't do. Like, she knows what it feels like to be on the ground with a big, strong man who's trying to choke her, who's trying to hold her down, because she does that all the time. So we want to try and avoid physical confrontations, obviously, and avoid those situations. But should she ever find herself there, she's going to be at home. She's not going to be surprised. She's going to be where we spend time all the time. And then last but not least, there's a great element of surprise, because I would feel bad for just the general street slug, you know, like crackhead who all of a sudden decides to attack Leah on the ground and then finds himself triangle choked to armbar, because he'd have no idea, you know, what was coming to him or what was about to happen, because I'm sure that's not what he would expect. So it can be done. It's hard work, and it takes time. And so I think the short workshops are mostly useful just for teaching people how important it is to be assertive and practicing being assertive. I mean, that's what we drill. We drill mostly being assertive. But I do encourage women to train and to sign up and train in combat sports. Just training consistently in a combat sport, even for a year or two, will also, going back to what we talked about before on the sidewalk, crossing the road, it'll change how you walk around. It'll change how you carry yourself, just naturally how you carry yourself, in a way that is going to make you less likely to get picked on the predator shopping list.
Right. And finally, I wonder, I mean, you've trained with a lot of men over the years. You've trained a lot of men over the years. I mean, what have you learned about men and male violence and masculinity in all this work that you've done, training in mixed martial arts, jiu-jitsu, etc.?
That's a good question. I think that there is a type of man, category of men, who can't do what we do. They can't come into the gym and submit. Can't put themselves in a position where they're going to have to tap over and over again or get hit in the face. And those are the ones who are most likely to lose their temper. Those are the ones who are most likely to be reactive aggressive. Those are the ones who are most likely to be, I think, character disordered. And you can kind of see it when they come into the gym, and you can kind of see that they're not going to last, not because anybody's going to be rough with them, because my gym, everybody's very nice. And, you know, our number one goal is to make it welcoming for everybody that comes in. But I can just see this is a guy whose ego is not going to allow him to deal with that. And that's somebody who has other problems, and probably somebody that I would, you know, that's not somebody I'd want dating my daughter. And you can kind of, I guess the longer I do this, the more I've done it, you can kind of see that coming almost a mile away now. when they're coming in the mat, and you just go, and I don't mean that in a condescending way where like, oh, he doesn't do what I do, so he can't last. I don't mean it that way. I just mean there's a certain type of man who can't lose over and over again. And what you have to do to be good at jujitsu or fighting is like losing isn't just okay. It's an essential, like necessary, essential part of our process. And if you can't put yourself in a situation where you're going to lose over and over again, you're not going to be able to do what we do. And I think that is a reflection of bigger problems that will manifest. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is so many men, and I think just like women and everybody else, have a lot of issues related to anxiety, social anxiety. A lot of people were bullied. When you start to talk to the people who come into the gym and they start to open up a little bit, I'm always kind of amazed at the story. Everybody has a story of, which is often, quite bad. Maybe an abusive father, or were bullied in school, or a little bit autistic, all kinds of different things that you wouldn't necessarily think, if you just met them and just talked to them a bit, because they've gotten quite good at being able to mask those things in their short daily interactions. But after you spend a little time with them on the mat, you get to know them a little bit better. Some of those things start to come out a bit. And I guess it has constantly reminds me of just how common that is. It's very, 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 very common. And that's probably the thing I like about jiu-jitsu the best, is if somebody comes in and they're willing to stick with it, it really does help all that stuff. I've had kids come in who were on the spectrum a little bit, to the point where when I would introduce myself to them or talk, they couldn't look at me and they couldn't really hold a conversation, and they were terrified of social interactions, and they had massive amounts of anxiety that they're living with. And honestly, 2 or 3 years later of training and rolling in the gym, and there's no therapy. It's not us talking to them about it. There's nothing. It's just the process itself, just the process of getting in there and going hands-on and rolling and failing, and sometimes winning and failing, and sometimes winning in a physical way with another human body. And a year or two later, they're like different people. They're teaching class. They're looking at you. And that's the part I think that's the most beautiful about what we do. But men are just like everybody else. Then when I meet somebody who doesn't have those kind of issues, I'm starting to think at this point in my life that they're now they're the small minority. Like everybody else is actually carrying all this baggage around with them. And when I meet somebody who's like, wow, they had a great childhood, they don't seem to have any kind of social anxiety or anything like that, well, that's like,
right.
the ones that are in the small category.
Right. I mean, so you must believe in people's ability to change. I mean, we can talk about extremes. I mean, most people probably have the ability to change, but what about those people who have character disorders? I mean, do you think that those kinds of men, let's say, men who are or have been abusive, men who are reactive, men who aren't willing to be accountable for their actions, take responsibility for their actions, is that something that can be addressed?
I like to think that it can, and I'm sure that in some cases it can. But I think the big piece there that holds them back is failure to take personal responsibility. Because as long as that failure to take personal responsibility piece is in the equation, I don't think they really can change.
Right.
And so that has to stop. The excuses have to stop. And usually for them to come to that point, there's like a really dark night of the soul type thing that they have to come to grips with. There's some things that they're going to have to look at that maybe they've been avoiding looking at for a long time. And as long as they're dodging that and they don't get over that part, I'm very pessimistic about their ability to change. But as soon as they stop that part, as soon as they take personal responsibility for everything that's happened, truly, and 10 seconds later, they're not making up another excuse for it, then I think it's possible. I like to think it's possible.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation. And again, I think this book is great, and I hope that everyone reads it. It's The Gift of Violence. Can you tell people where they can find the book?
Yes, you can pick up The Gift of Violence wherever books are sold. So you can pre-order it now on Amazon. You can pre-order it on Barnes & Noble, and you can pre-order it on IndieWare, I think it is. But Amazon or Barnes & Noble for sure. You can look it up, get it pre-ordered on there. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.